Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic. Let's do it. Who is the scariest person you have ever met? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I once, as a medical student, was doing a rotation in the state mental prison. We had to do basic physical on this guy. There was a chair in the middle of the room, bolted to the floor. He had cuffs on his wrists and feet secured to the chair. 9 guards were in the room surrounding us, not more than 5 feet from the chair in a circle. He was off, just not there, and didn't want to cooperate. He looked at me, saw my coat, and said, "That guy is from the university. I want to talk to him." Still don't know how or what he had done, but after a few months of the rotation, no one else had the degree of security for medical visits. No one else was even close. I live in New Mexico and met Big Dragon from Beyond Scared Straight. He does outreach like that with troubled kids. I was working as a teacher at YDDC. They brought him down. Dude's no joke. I shook his hand and you could just tell the only reason he was not killing people was he didn't want to. Because if he did, the guards would have not been able to do anything about it. I got arrested for public intoxication in the mid to late 90s and was put in a normal cell because the drunk tank was full. About 10 minutes later, I was woken up and hastily moved to an adjoining cell. I visited with the guy in the first cell I was in for a few hours. When I was bailed out, I bumped knuckles with Gary, guy in the other cell, and left. I later found out he was Gary Klipus, and he was being held on first-degree murder and dismemberment of a body of a college student. I also found out later in the day after I left, he beat the next guy who was put in a cell nearly to death. My uncle was in prison with Kip Kinkle, a teenage boy who murdered his parents, went to school and shot it up, killing a couple of kids and wounding a couple dozen others. It was one of the high schools in my hometown. I was only about 7 years old at the time, but I remember it vividly. Our school and every other school in town went into a lockdown for a number of hours. Anyway, my uncle was in a gang. He's been shot a couple times, God only knows what else. Years later, as an adult, I asked my uncle what it's like to meet Kip Kinkle, and he said, "Nah, he ain't no killer. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was just a scared little punk." That comment admittedly made my skin crawl a little. Yep, my uncle is the scariest person I've ever met. Got a DUI back in '09, was taken to the Placer County drunk tank. Guy with tattoos all over his face approaches me. I think I'm for sure getting AR'd. Nope, he wanted to offer me his roll of toilet paper for a pillow. He introduced himself as Sow City Psycho. He told me he would watch over me to make sure nobody effed with me because he could tell I did not have much experience in jail. Now looking back on it, I guess for a few hours there, I was his bitch. Super nice guy though, 10 out of 10, would be his bitch again. Once did one of those corporate mock jury panels. The little scientist analytics guy came out halfway through to shoot the breeze, and holy hell. I never understood what people meant by having a magnetic personality until then. We were clamoring over this dude. It was completely involuntary. He asked me a question, and it was an out-of-body experience watching myself act like a golden retriever. I was so freaked out that I avoided him like the plague the rest of the panel. Nice dude. Seemed chill, but he could have started a cult with the snap of his fingers. Absolutely terrifying. It's always something to aspire to. Become a cult leader. It generally ends well. So I went to a bachelor party for a friend, and we had a stripper there. The girl came, and everything went smoothly. She came with her security and pimp, who was the real big black guy with this bad air around him. He was silent and stared at everyone and just overall very creepy. I asked if he wanted a drink or something to eat since he was there anyway, and he just stared at me without saying anything. I found out a little more than a year later than this guy was killing hookers and leaving them in abandoned houses. This was in Gary, so there's a ton of abandoned houses. I was at a bar and this guy walks in, and immediately it felt like I was on alert. My spine turned to ice when I saw his eyes look at me. They were almost sunken into his face, as if he was peeking out from behind a portrait. He moved like a cat stalking prey. Over time, he made his way over to me and made polite conversation, but his words felt disjointed. almost like he was translating them before speaking them. There was nothing aggressive or insulting about anything he was doing. In fact, he was quite polite. But everything about this guy was setting off every nerve I had. He was even smiling through most of it, but it felt as if his lips were stapled back. When I ran with a gang, there were a few scary dudes, but one more than the rest. Tall dude with long hair, didn't speak much. One point, we were all chilling on a balcony. Another dude got a big mouth and said something to him and can't remember what. Without hesitating, this guy stood up, slid a knife into this other dude's leg and chucked him off the balcony and just sat down with a beer and smoke like nothing happened. Dude didn't fall too far, but had quite a few broken bones. This was the only one of the things this guy did, but this was the most memorable, as this was the day I met him. My grandpa's second wife, Angie, she was a hateful woman. I don't believe in people being 100% anything, but she was pure evil. Had a collection of porcelain dolls in a corner of their house when I was very young, and she would always try to talk to me through them. One time I touched a Pillsbury Doughboy figure on her shelf and she swatted my hand with a metal ruler. Eventually, she pretty much overdosed my grandpa on morphine and he died. She was in her 70s when I was a young kid. I'm 30 now. I heard from my aunt that she's still alive somewhere near where she lived with my grandpa, which makes me believe she's some kind of hag witch and that she's committed insurance fraud like a lot. I was working at a bar in a pretty small town when we had a drifter come in on a random midweek night. The second he walked through the door, everyone I worked with and was at the bar said they felt cold. Dude had incredibly sunken eyes, pale white skin, dingy dirty hair, and visibly sharp-looking teeth. If I was to explain what a mako shark as a human would be, that's this guy. He said he was passing through and was looking for stuff ordinary people can't find, then proceeded to show photos on his phone of odd areas he had been to previously. Nothing was off about the photos, but every one I saw gave me more chills. Nothing was happening, no one was there, but everything had this feeling of I'm not supposed to be here. The dude left and asked me to follow him on Instagram, which I did. He posted last a few years ago up in Jackson Hole and said he'd be staying off for a while. Odd dude. We were quite relieved when his cab showed up. So this guy was scary if you didn't know him. When I first met up, I didn't know him. His name was Eddie, fake. He loved steroids, working out, and fighting people. As big of a person as I can imagine. Eddie got into a fight at a party with some gangbanger type. Gangbangers, not very honorable people, did not take the loss well. Put out a hit on him. A couple of days later, an SUV full of bangers rolls up and he's walking home. Decide that 5 of them aren't enough to take down Eddie. Instead, they run him down, back over him, run over him again, back up over him, then drive over him and take off. Eddie walked to the hospital. A former client, not big enough to be truly scary, but someday. He did enough damage as it was, beat 2 staff literally half to death, broke another one's nose for asking him not to pull their hair, so many concussions, thousands of dollars in damages to both company property and staffs, televisions, windows, doors, gaming systems, windshields, glasses, phones, teeth, bones, literally every escalation every single day ended up being an attempted murder. We could on a good day expect 2 to 4 or them per shift, sometimes lasting hours. They got mad at us if we called the police to help us. They didn't want him to look bad in the community. We weren't officially forbidden from personally pressing charges, but it was not encouraged. Everyone did everything to make sure he never faced any consequences. For the first 2 staffs he pulverized, he had to draw a picture to say he was sorry. He was almost 14. He finished the picture, looked the staff with him in the eye and said, "I'm not sorry. I'm glad I did it. I wish I'd hurt them worse. I wish I'd killed them." It was my job to work with him. When he wasn't in a rage, he had his decent moments. In one calm conversation, we were playing Legos or something. I asked him if he'd like to talk about some ways to avoid hurting people when he gets angry. This kid looked me dead in the eyes and said, "No, I don't want to stop hurting people. I like hurting people." I asked him why. He shrugged. "I just like it. It's fun." I believed him. I mean, if a 14-year-old is saying those things and acting out that way, What can really be done? I'm just asking. Like, obviously, you can keep him institutionalized or protect him, but will he eventually go out into the world? If we can probably draw some conclusions and it's inevitable. Pissed off Dwayne Johnson. Let me explain. A few years ago, I was a part of a charity event with Power of Pain. A family friend who I call my aunt, Barbie, owns the charity for neuropathy and other immune disorders. And funny enough, we somehow got Dwayne Johnson as a guest. We'd contacted him, but didn't expect him to actually come. He was an effing great guy, honestly. Best effing dude in the world. Anyway, after the event, a lot of us went to a Denny's down the road to celebrate, not expecting him to be there, though he was invited. He shows up like 20 minutes after we all get there, and he's having a blast, hanging out, eating pancakes, but unbeknownst to the rest of us, there was a domestic dispute across the Denny's. A couple who seemed like they were about to break up, but more like the guy was just an abusive asshole screaming at his girlfriend the whole time, and her just in tears. Dwayne catches wind, stands up, puts on his rock persona, and has an effing screaming match with this guy, and he's just receding further and further into a shell, and eventually he just effing leaves. Dwayne pays her bill, helps her stop crying, and walked her out to her car. He then came back in with a smile and continued having a good night and finished his pancakes. He's a beautiful, kind-hearted man, but if you piss him off, he will make you shit yourself. Remember, they call him the Rock for a reason. Best night of my life. And moral of the story, be nice to people, because if you're not, you may find yourself in a situation you just can't win. So when I first started reading this, your first sentence said, pissed off Dwayne Johnson. I thought you pissed off Dwayne Johnson, not realizing what you meant was a pissed off Dwayne Johnson. So now it makes sense. The Rock? I guess he's a good dude, right? Many years ago, my husband posted an ad at our apartment complex looking for new gaming buddies, D&D, Pathfinder, Shadowrun, etc. One of the people who responded was a maintenance worker at the complex. He seemed nice when my husband first met him, so he invited him over. The guy claimed many years of gaming experience, but when he started talking, he was saying he'd played all these editions of games that didn't exist. We thought he'd gotten some terminology mixed up, so we asked, "Oh, do you mean this edition?" He'd get mad and say, "No, he meant what he said." Sometimes people are scared to admit they don't have experience, so my husband said, "Hey, it's okay. I don't have a problem teaching people." But the guy kept insisting, no, he actually had played those games before. But whenever he talked about it, it was clear he hadn't played any of them. No knowledge of system mechanics, nothing about previous groups he'd been on, not even the usual anecdotes gamers love to share. Realizing something was up, my husband said politely that it didn't seem like it'd work out, and he was sorry he'd taken up the guy's time. The guy wasn't mad, he just seemed surprised and left. Fast forward a few days, my husband's sleeping in, I'm up with my toddler. There's a knock at the door. I answer it, and it's this guy. He immediately starts talking about how his ride flaked on him, and he didn't want to walk home in the summer heat, and could I drive him home? I've known the hassle of not having a car, so I was sympathetic. "Let me get my husband," I said, because he was a lot better at driving our van than I was. The guy suddenly started loudly insisting, "No, don't wake him up. I could drive him. It'd be really quick." He only lived at a address a mile or so away. I told him, "No, I've got my kid here. It'd be easier to get my husband to do it." "It's gotta be you," he kept saying over and over. A little alarm in my head went off, and I said, "I'm not comfortable with that. You need to find another ride." I closed the door in his face and locked it. I'm autistic and don't always have the greatest grasp on social stuff. I started wondering if I'd been too harsh or jumpy or what. I went in, woke up my husband, and told him what happened. He told me, no, that did sound hinky. I didn't overreact at all, threw on his clothes, grabbed his keys, and went outside, but not without telling me to lock the door behind him. He was gone for a while, and then he came back looking disturbed. The manager said the guy just left. His mom picked him up, just like she's been picking him up the whole time, and he doesn't live at a address guy gave me. He lives at a place in the opposite direction. The manager told him the guy had just been a contractor. It was totally inappropriate for him to be asking tenants for rides, even if we'd met him once before. She assured us that he wasn't coming back. I never saw him again. We moved out about a year later. 5 or so years later, my husband calls me over to the computer to read something. It's an article about how a maintenance worker over at our former apartment had just gotten arrested for SAing several tenants. He was using his master key to enter apartments. One of the women was only a teenager. When the women reported what happened to the owners, it turned out the manager we'd known no longer worked there. The owners threatened them with evicting if they called the police. Thank God one of them ignored the threat and called. There was a picture. It was the same guy. I was absolutely horrified. We figured out that the guy probably never tried it with me because he didn't always know for sure if my husband was home a lot. I also figured that he never tried because my response that day showed I wouldn't just blindly agree with anything he said. I have no idea what would have happened if I'd driven that guy home that day, as he was telling me to go in the opposite direction of where he lived. I don't imagine it would have been pretty. If that little alarm bell goes off in your head, folks, listen to it. Don't worry about being rude or overreacting. I'm an inpatient counselor working with children and adolescents. I've met my fair share of kids I'd never turn my back on. Definitely have come across future family annihilators and mass murderers. I've currently got the creepiest one to date. A few days ago in Shift Report, we're told about a new young man brought in by the FBI. It's not unusual to have kids brought in by police escort, but this is a first. So his home was raided because he was posting threats of extreme violence on various social media, as well as calling in bomb threats to local businesses. Some of his threats include R-ing all women and murdering all the children. It's all been found to be credible threats for many reasons, including a list that was found of what he needs to obtain, where and how to make contact information. He is soon to turn 18 and will likely be charged as an adult. Anyways, I walk into the unit and know immediately which new patient the treatment team was referring to. The kid looks exactly like Richie Ramirez, right down to the greasy hair and janky teeth. He just sits and stares at everyone through his hair and barely says a word except demanding to call his mom to tell her to get rid of some stuff. Everyone can feel the ick coming off of him, like it emanates from his pores. Real bad juju with that one.